What hadn't you tried? You're already a huge success.
Climbing Mount Everest in the nude has always been.
You can let him do that?
Stop if he wants to, he can.
I'm bulletproof, but I can't fly yet.
Picture the most famous Australian on the planet. A man who turned a $9 million film into a $200 million phenomenon. Now picture that same man, decades later, watching the woman who once played his on-screen soulmate walk out of his life for good. No scandal. No headlines screaming betrayal. Just silence. And 23 years unraveling behind closed doors. Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski weren't just another Hollywood couple. They were Crocodile Dundee and Sue Charlton brought to life. The world fell for them on screen first, before either of them even admitted what was happening between takes. For years, they looked untouchable. But behind that image, something was already cracking. A tax war that would follow him for a decade. A fortune frozen. A family stretched thin by pressure most people never see. And when it finally ended, it didn't end with fireworks. It ended with paperwork and a settlement that shocked almost everyone watching. So what really happened behind that fairy tale marriage? Stay with me, because the real story is nothing like the tabloids told it. Before the fame, before the fortune, Paul Hogan was just a rigger on the Sydney Harbor Bridge. No training, no connections, just nerve and a sharp sense of humor that would change his entire life. He walked onto a talent show as a joke, mocking the judges instead of performing for them. Audiences loved it so much they kept calling him back. That accident of fate became The Paul Hogan Show and turned him into a household name. Then came 1986. Nobody expected Crocodile Dundee to go global. But it exploded, becoming one of the biggest films on earth that year. Overnight, Paul Hogan wasn't just an Australian celebrity anymore. He belonged to the world. On that same set, he met a young Juilliard-trained actress named Linda Kozlowski. She played Sue Charlton, the sharp city journalist who falls for his rugged outback charm. On screen, it was chemistry. Off screen, it turned into something real. There was just one problem. Hogan was still tangled in a bitter, ongoing divorce from his first wife. One of the ugliest splits Australia had ever watched play out in public. By the time it finally ended, Hogan and Kozlowski were ready to make it official. They married in 1990. To the world, it looked like the perfect ending to a real-life fairy tale. They built a life in Los Angeles, raised a son named Chance, and for years, they looked like the one Hollywood couple who had actually figured it out. But underneath that image, pressure was already building. And this time, it wasn't coming from inside the marriage first. It was coming from something far more dangerous. In the early 2000s, the Australian Taxation Office opened an investigation into Hogan's finances. At first, it looked routine. It wasn't. By 2007, his name was tied to one of the largest tax fraud investigations in Australian history. Hundreds of millions of dollars under scrutiny. Suddenly, headlines weren't about his movies anymore. They were about offshore accounts, frozen assets, and a reputation under siege. Then it got personal. In 2010, Hogan flew home for his own mother's funeral. Instead of being allowed to grieve in peace, he was hit with an order banning him from leaving the country. He compared the tax office to some of the most feared institutions in the world. This wasn't the easygoing outback hero the world knew. This was a man cornered and fighting for everything he had left. For years, that fight hung over his entire life, and a marriage rarely survives that kind of pressure untouched. But what happened next changed everything, and it had nothing to do with the tax office anymore. By 2012, Hogan finally settled with the authorities. On paper, the storm looked over. It wasn't. The marriage never recovered. In October 2013, Linda Kozlowski filed for divorce. 23 years. Over. No affair. No public blow-up. Just two people who had quietly drifted into strangers. Here's what makes it even more shocking. Just 1 month before that filing, they'd stood together at a black-tie gala in Los Angeles, smiling for cameras like nothing was wrong. Nobody in that room saw it coming. And there's another detail that only makes sense in hindsight. Weeks before the divorce became public, they sold their Malibu mansion, the home where they raised their son, to fellow Australian star Chris Hemsworth. No one thought much of it at the time. Looking back, it was the first quiet sign that everything was already ending. The truth wasn't hidden affairs or explosive betrayal. It was something far more human, and honestly far sadder. Two people who built an entire life together, slowly becoming strangers under the same roof. But the real turning point wasn't the filing. It was what came next, because this divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about untangling a piece of film history itself. Kozlowski sought spousal support and custody of their teenage son. But the bigger question loomed over everything. What happens to Sue Charlton and Michael Dundee, the characters that made them both famous, when the real-life couple behind them falls apart? In the end, Kozlowski walked away with a lump sum settlement, reported at over $5.5 million. She kept the right to stay in their Venice Beach home for several more years. They agreed to share custody of their son with no ongoing support on either side. But here's the detail that says everything. Kozlowski received 0 rights to the Crocodile Dundee franchise. None. Hogan kept the character, the films, the entire empire built around them. All to himself. For a couple whose public identity had been built entirely around those roles, that single detail changed how the whole story reads. The on-screen love story still belonged to Hogan. The real one, the one that lasted 23 years, was over. And yet his reaction wasn't bitter. He later said a quarter-century together couldn't really be called a failure. That real failed marriages are the ones where people stay long after the love is already gone. A strangely calm response for a man whose marriage had just quietly ended in front of the whole world. What came after revealed just how differently their two lives would unfold. Kozlowski later described the split as completely amicable. She said they still talked often, even shared coffee together as friends. In an industry built on bitter headline-grabbing divorces, this was something rare. Then her life took a turn nobody expected. While traveling through Morocco, she met a local tour guide. She described the connection as instant, almost like they'd known each other for a lifetime. They married in 2017. Hogan's path looked nothing like that. He kept acting, but nothing came close to matching the height of Crocodile Dundee again. His image had already been reshaped, not by scandal in his marriage, but by years of tax battles fought in public. Then, in 2017, his entire life story was turned into a television miniseries in Australia. His rise from bridge worker to global icon, his marriage, all of it dramatized for the screen. Somewhere out there, Linda Kozlowski watched an actress play her own life back to her. But here's the part that puts the whole story into focus. For over 2 decades, these two gave the world one of its most convincing love stories, on screen and off. And when it finally ended, it ended quietly, fairly, and without the hatred everyone expected. Today, at 86, Paul Hogan's story looks less like a Hollywood scandal and more like something painfully human. A marriage tested by fame, by financial war, by time itself, until it simply ran its course. Linda Kozlowski found new love in a place neither of them could have imagined back in their Malibu years. Hogan remains tied forever to the character that made him a legend, long after the marriage connected to that legacy quietly closed its final chapter. Not every celebrity love story ends in betrayal. Sometimes it just ends. And maybe that's the part no one expected at all. So tell me, do you think this was one of Hollywood's rare, peaceful endings? Or do you think there's more to this story than either of them ever admitted? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if stories like this pull you in, subscribe, because there are so many more waiting to be told.